Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Eruvin Daf continues the discussion of two courtyards with a wall between them. The wall is 10 tvachim tall and therefore divides the courtyards into two separate yards, and you cannot make an error between the two of them together. As we have seen, if you find a way to raise the floor level so that the wall is no longer 10 tvachim high from the floor level to the top of the wall, that might solve the problem. If you do it on both sides, then you can consider it that there is a path over the wall, a functional, usable path over the wall, and therefore you can join the two yards together into one Erev Chatzeres. Also, if the top of the wall is a rishus, if it's 4 tvachim wide, then you can use the top of the wall. You consider yourself having access to the top of the wall. So the Gemara on Daf Ayin Ches has a long list of questions and answers and halachos as to what you can do to minimize the height of the wall by raising the floor level. Now, as we have seen, in order to raise the floor level, you have to raise an area that's at least 4 tvachim wide, and that platform, that raising, has to be connected to the floor. Meaning, if you're going to stick something in the air and have it suspended there somehow, that won't raise the floor level. It has to be connected to the floor by some manner. It could be through lava, it could have spaces, but it's got to be connected to the floor. Now, it doesn't have to be 4 tvachim wide all the way down. Just the top has to be 4 tvachim wide. So now the Gemara brings a number of halachas in this area. First of all, Rav Nachman says in the name of Rabbi Baravua, what if you have a platform kind of sticking out of the wall? And that platform is 4 tvachim wide. The problem is it's in the air, so it's not reaching the ground, so it's no good. But if you have a ladder leaning against it, and the ladder has no spaces between its rungs greater than 3 tvachim, so that connects it to the ground, even though the ladder itself is not 4 tvachim wide. However, the ladder has to be leaning on the platform that sticks out of the wall. If it's just near it, then it doesn't connect it. Now, the Gemara says further, if you have a wall that's 19 tvachim high and you have one platform sticking out midway up, that's good enough, because you won't have 10 tvachim from the ground to the platform. Again, you have the ladder there, and you don't have 10 tvachim from the top of the platform to the top of the wall. So it's enough to have just one platform there. If, however, it's 20 tvachim high, then you have to have two platforms, because if you just have one in the middle, you can have a 10 tefach gap somewhere, either from the floor to the platform or from the platform to the top of the wall. So the Gemara says, but you should just make sure to be careful that the two platforms should not be one directly above the other one, because you have to have a ladder going from the lower one to the upper one as well. Otherwise, the upper one's floating in the air. It's got to be connected to the lower one. So have them be not one on top of the other. Then you could have a ladder from the floor to the bottom one, and then you can angle sideways along the wall from the bottom one to the top one, as long as it's not directly above it specifically. Now, the Gemara quotes Rav Huna, who goes on a slightly different subject over here. We're talking about where you have a column in the middle of Rishus Harabim that's 4 tvachim by 4 tvachim wide, and it is 10 tvachim high. So this is its own Rishus. It's a Rishus HaYachid. It's 4 by 4 and 10 high. However, says Rav Huna, if you stick a peg on the top surface of that column, it's no longer usable. You don't have a 4 tefach by 4 tefach wide surface that's functional. There's a peg in the way, and therefore it's no longer a Rishus HaYachid. It divides up the Rishus HaYachid. It's now less than 4 by 4 usable space, because there's this thing in the way. So the Gemara says that that's the statement of Rav Huna was to stick in the peg. The question is, how high does the peg have to be? So Rav Ada Bar Ava says it's got to be at least 3 tvachim high, in order that it's not low, but it's significantly sticking up. Abaye and Rava said, no, it doesn't have to be any height. As long as it's there, it's interfering with the usage of the surface of the column. As long as it's useless, so it's not functional, it's not a rishus, and therefore it doesn't get its own status as Rishus HaYachid. Rashi said, you know what, even if it's 3 tvachim high, it still doesn't make it useless, because it's still useful. You could still use the rishus. That peg stuck in the surface could function as a hook. So Gemara says, okay, one peg could function as a hook. What would Rashi say if the entire surface is full of many pegs? You can't use that. 1,000 hooks near each other is not going to be functional, and it's not functional as a surface either with all the pegs in it. So what would be the halacha there? Would Rashi say, no, it's still, you still view it as a functional? What's it sad that you could still view it as a functional? Because you could always put a board on top of all these hooks and then use it that way, or a sheet. So Gemara says, they're bringing a halacha from Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says clearly that if you have a pit in the ground, and the pit is not 10 tvachim deep. However, you've built little walls around the sides of the pit upwards from the surface, and now from the top of the walls down to the bottom of the pit is 10 tvachim. That counts as a 10 tefach high area. Also, if the pit is not 10 tvachim wide in its opening, but the walls on the side add up to 10 tefachim, so you can combine, 4 tefachim wide. If it's not 4 tefachim wide in its opening, but plus the walls on the side, it adds up to 4 tefachim, so then you have a pit that's minimum size. It's 10 tefachim deep with a combination of the depth of the pit and the walls around it, and it's 4 by 4 tefachim wide with a combination of the floor of the pit and the walls around the outside rim of the pit on the ground level. So Rabbi Yechon says those things can combine. Now, how do those things combine? You want to make Rishos Yachad out of that, but it's not useful. You can't do anything. So obviously, what you could do is you could put a board on it and use it. So here too, you could put a board on it and use it. It shouldn't be a problem at all as far as these halachas are concerned. Now says the Gemara, back to the ladders leaning against the wall. Let's say you want to lean a ladder against the wall, just a ladder, and that's going to serve as raising ground level. You don't have a platform anywhere. The ladder is 4 tefachim wide, whatever it is, and it's going to serve as your raising ground level because you have steps all the way up. That's going to be a platform. Now, if your wall is 10 tefachim high, so says Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, you got to lean the ladder at an angle. You can't put the ladder straight up against the wall. You won't be able to climb it like that. So how long does the ladder have to be at an angle in order to be able to hit the top of the wall? Now this is mathematics. You have a right angle created by the wall and the floor. Your ladder would be the hypotenuse of a right triangle formed by the wall and the floor and the ladder. So how long does that ladder have to be? So we'll go with Tos's pshat over here. He says if the wall is 10 tefachim, you want to put the ladder at least 10 tefachim away from the base of the wall. You want the bottom of the ladder, the foot of the ladder, to be at least 10 tefachim away from the base of the wall. So that means that the two legs of your right triangle are 10 and 10. The ladder itself has to be 14. The hypotenuse of that triangle would be 14. Chazal have a rule that the hypotenuse is always 2/5 longer than the legs if the legs are the same height. So same length. So the Gemara says, so that's his opinion, it has to be 14. Gemara now brings another opinion which says that the ladder doesn't have to hit the top of the wall. Rav Yosef says as long as it's within a tefach of the top of the wall, it's enough. So the ladder only has to be 13 and a bit, so that it hits within a bit of the top of the wall. Within a tefach of the top of the wall. Abaye says it only has to be within 3 tefachim, and therefore the ladder only has to be 11 tefachim and a bit. Rav Yeshua says the ladder could even be 7 tefachim and a bit, and that's because you're not going to lean it. He holds you could stand it straight up as long as it reaches within 10 tefachim at the top of the wall. You're good. Within 3 tefachim at the top of the wall, it functions as lavud, and that's not an issue at all. Now the Gemara here is assuming that the ladder has to get all the way up to the top of the wall, or halachically close enough to be considered reaching the top of the wall. This is not quite as we saw it earlier, but this is a different approach. Now the Gemara says, where does Rav get his halacha that he says that a straight vertical ladder is enough to make the wall not be considered too high? Rav says he doesn't know, he says this halacha, but he doesn't know where it's from. So Shmuel says, why does he say he doesn't know where this halacha is from? It's a clear source. We saw on Daf Ayin Zayin, if you take two tables, two built platforms, not coming out of the wall, but platforms that you built, and you put one on top of the other, they combine. And the reason why they combine is because they function like steps, like a ladder. And if one on top of the other, it's straight up. So just like that works, this should work as well. Okay, now the Gemara talks about other things which can be used to place on the floor, not ladders which will raise the floor level. We'll get back to ladders later. So Gemara says if you have a bundle of branches of Babylonian trees, so that's very heavy and nobody's going to walk off of them. They're going to stay there for a very long time, and you don't have to attach them to the ground just because they're heavy. Rav Yosef says even if you put Babylonian ladders there, those are also heavy. You don't have to fix them to the ground. So Gemara says the ladders are not as heavy as the trees. So the one who said that you can use trees would not say that about ladders, but one who said you can use ladders and that's heavy enough would say that about trees as well. Okay, now we have a few shalas about how to extend the width of the ladder. The ladder, in order for it to be considered to be a doorway up and over the wall, an entrance, a passageway across the wall, has got to be at least 4 tvachim wide. So what happens if you have two ladders that are each less than 2 tvachim wide, but you want to stick a couple of thin straws between the ladders as additional rungs, and then that should serve as one big ladder. So the Gemara says you can't go up that ladder. People naturally step in the middle of the ladder, and here the middle is made out of straw. So it's not a functional ladder. So the Gemara says, okay, what if I take one ladder and I stick pieces of straw on both left and right sides of it? So now I have a functional ladder that's 4 tvachim wide by the straw. Now Rashi explains you could hold on to the straws with your hand. They are strong enough to do that. You just can't step on them. The Gemara says that's good because when you walk up a ladder, you hold on to the sides and you step in the middle. That's not a problem. Okay, now the Gemara says, let's say my ladder is not tall enough, but I'm going to carve out footholds in the wall in order to get up higher. So my ladder is not wide enough, far enough up. I need to make it wider to 4 tvachim by carving out footholds alongside the ladder. How high up the wall do I have to go? So the answer is you have to go up to 10 tvachim. You don't have to go all the way up to the top of the wall. He says, what if the entire ladder itself is just a bunch of footholds carved into the wall? There you have to make them all the way up the wall. And says, why? And says, because that's much harder to climb and people aren't going to be able to use it, aren't going to be able to get to the top of the wall. It won't be functional unless it goes all the way up. Okay. Now the Gemara has a couple of questions about using something that's forbidden to actually use. That means you want to set up something which is usher for you to actually go over the wall, but the doorway is still there, meaning the passageway set up over the wall still exists. You just can't do it because you'll have to do an isser to get over it. Does that count or not? Now the Gemara is going to have 2 questions. Each one the Gemara will bring a machlokes tanaim that's related to it, and the Gemara say the question applies according to both sides of the machlokes tanaim. So the first is, let's say you have a growing tree near the wall. You could climb the tree and get over the wall. The problem is you're not allowed to go on a tree on Shabbos. It's an Isser Darabanan. So the Gemara says there's a machlokes between Rebbe and the Chachamim as to whether or not you're allowed to put an Erev Tchumin in a tree on Shabbos. According to Rebbe, you're allowed to, because Erev Tchumin only hits and it only needs to be accessible at the moment of when Shabbos begins, which is during Beinish Moshes. During that moment, all Isurei Derabanan don't count. Isurei Derabanan don't apply Beinish Moshes, and therefore it's okay if your Erev Tchumin is in a tree, because to get something out of the tree is only an Isser Derabanan, therefore it's accessible. That's what Rebbe holds. The problem here is that here you need to be able to get over the wall the entire Shabbos. So it's not enough Beinish Moshes. So maybe Rebbe would say here that it's forbidden. On the other hand, maybe Rebbe would say that it's okay. Maybe even the Rabbanan, who don't hold of that heter of Beinish Moshes, would say it's okay here, because you don't need to get over the ladder. You have to have a passageway set up. There's a passageway set up. That I can't get over it because I'll have to do an Isser Rabbanan to get over it is like there's a lion standing, crouching at the foot of my passageway and not allowing me through. It doesn't mean that the passageway doesn't exist. It's still there. So the Gemara says, you have another question. What if there's a ladder made out of wood from an Asherah tree? So the ladder's an Isser Hana. You're not allowed to use the ladders. You can't climb the ladder. Similar kind of scenario. You can't get over the ladder, but the ladder is actually there. It's set up. So now the machlokes tanaim that's here is, are you allowed to use Isurei Hana for a mitzvah? Rabbi Yehuda holds you're allowed to set up your Erev Tchumin in a grave, even though you're not allowed to make a grave into your house. But this is just doing a mitzvah, so you can set it up and it's not a problem. Now that's just at the moment when the Erev Tchumin applies. When it hits in the first moment where there's a mitzvah. Here, it's got to be accessible to you the entire Shabbos. You have to be able to get up the ladder on Shabbos in order for it to be a passageway. So maybe Rabbi Yehuda would say no, that here it's no good. It's not like the case of the Erev Tchumin in the grave. Even though the grave is an Isser Hana, you're allowed to do it, because at the moment that you're creating, at the moment that you need to be able to use it, it's just Isurei Hana. But this is a mitzvah, and Isurei Hana doesn't block a mitzvah. We have a rule, mitzvahs lav lehunas nitnu. On the other hand, maybe Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim here would both agree that this is not a problem, because the ladder is there, it's set up, the passageway over the wall exists, there's just something blocking it, there's a lion there. So, as far as Psak, the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says that the Psak that was given was that the tree is a good passageway, and therefore you could make an Erev Chatzos between the two courtyards, but the Asherah ladder, the Isser Hana Avodah Zarah ladder, is not. The Gemara says, Rav Chizda asked, it should be the opposite. In the case of the tree, it's an Isser Shabbos that's blocking you from getting over the wall. That should be no good. In Isser Shabbos itself, you can't make a halacha in Hilchos Shabbos that ignores another halacha in Hilchos Shabbos. The Shabbos minei ubei in and of itself that is interfering with itself. That should be no good. But if you have Isser Asherah, I can say fine. The Isser Asherah, that's like a lion. That's a side issue. That's not an issue. I don't have to worry about that as far as the fact that in Hilchos Shabbos I could say the passageway exists. So Gemara says, yeah, actually when Ravin came, he said the name of Rabbi Lazar, and some say Rabbi Avo, name of Rabbi Yechanan. As long as Isser Shabbos is what's interfering your use of the ladder, then it's not considered a valid passageway. As long as it's a side Isser, then it is considered a valid passageway. Final word on the Psak over here. Menachem Bar Yitzchak actually says it is dependent on the machlokes, and we said before. According to Rebbe and Rabbanan, It's a machlokes about a tree, and Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbanan would argue about whether or not you're allowed to use an Asherah. That ends this sugya in the Gemara. Now we start the next Mishnah, which discusses when you need to combine two chatzeros by means of building a bridge over a space underneath it. So the first case is we have two courtyards, two chatzeros that are divided all the way in half by a ditch or a trench that runs between them, and the trench is at least 4 tefachim wide, so you can't just jump across it. And the ditch is 10 tefachim deep, so it's deep enough to be considered a wall. Now, the halacha is that even if the ditch is filled with straw, different types of straw, kash or teven, that's not considered filled, and the ditch still divides the two chatzeros into two. You cannot make one erev chatzeros to combine the two because the straw is not going to stay there. It's not going to last. People generally move straw, and therefore it's not considered to be that the chatzeros have a passageway between them. On the other hand, if it's filled with dirt or gravel, then it is considered filled. That's not going to be moved, and you could just walk across, so it is considered to be that there is a bridge. In a case like that, you do have a passageway, but you do have a wall, so the two chatzeros have an option. They can combine or they can stay separate. And the same applies if you place a board that's at least 4 tefachim wide across the ditch, and people can walk across the board that functions as a bridge. Now, similar to this is if you have two houses on an upper floor. You have two upper floors across Rosh Hashanah from each other, and they each have a porch sticking out, and you want to put a board between the porches. That way you can actually walk across a bridge between the two porches, connect the two houses, and you should be able to make an erev chatzeros between the two. So we said, there's the Mishnah, the halacha is if the board is at least 4 tefachim wide, then you have a valid separation plus a passageway, a bridge across, and the two houses will have the option of joining in one erev chatzeros or choosing not to join in one erev chatzeros. Okay, we now begin the Gemara on this Mishnah. The Gemara says, why is straw not good enough to fill in the ditch? I'll bring you a proof that straw is considered to be a valid something that stays there, because if you have a straw heap between two chatzeros and it's forming a wall between the two, that divides the two chatzeros into two, and you cannot make an erev between them. So obviously it is a permanent fixture. So Abaye says no. As far as being a wall, it's enough even if it may be taken away. It doesn't have to be permanent because it's still blocking access from one chatzah to the other. However, as far as filling in the ditch, there it has to be something that's going to stay there long term, and straw we don't assume is going to stay there long term unless he specifically says, I'm leaving the straw here forever, and he plans on it staying here. Then you could hear, in a case like that, you would be able to combine the two chatzeros and consider that there's a passageway.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.